Dad's talking to the furniture again. A small voice came from behind Jack. He turned, smiling. Lena, his 8-year-old daughter, peeked her head through a nearby curtain, clutching a sketchbook. "Furniture, huh?" he said. "This isn't just furniture. It's a cathedral with 88 steps to heaven." Lena giggled and sat cross-legged, just outside the pool of light. Jack returned to his task. One hand polished the piano, but the other, what was it tracing? "Mr. Hollis," a crisp voice called out from across the stage. "Could you please hurry? Ms. Kingsley is arriving shortly, and everything needs to be perfect." Jack nodded silently. He never spoke in moments like these. He knew his place. But as he bent to gather his supplies, another voice tore through the air, this one laced with theatrical contempt. "Good God, he's caressing it as if he owns the thing." The voice belonged to Langston Gray, the music critic for the Times and a pompous arbiter of true talent. A few nearby staff members chuckled nervously. Jack didn't look up. He gathered his rags and brushes, slowly, methodically, folding them with a deliberate, almost excessive care. Langston continued, undeterred. "Well, aren't we the sentimental janitor? Planning on weeping into your mop bucket next?" More laughter, louder this time. Jack remained silent, but Lena had stopped sketching. Her eyes darted to her father. He picked up his bucket, turning to exit the stage. But Langston wasn't done with him. "Hold on," he called out, a calculated smirk spreading across his face. To Jack's surprise, the famous critic stepped forward, pulling out a small notebook and an expensive-looking pen. The gesture wasn't for note-taking, it was performance. A little piece of theater with Jack as the unwilling star. The act was pure showmanship. Langston Gray was offering a quick interview about the piano. In reality, he cared nothing for Jack. He wanted two things. First, to demonstrate his own erudite knowledge, and second, to fish for a sensational story about the overly sentimental janitor narrative he had just invented. "Tell me, my good man, do you even know what this is? This instrument you seem to revere so much?" Jack finally turned. He looked at Langston, not with anger, not with insult, but with a calm, steady gaze. "Yes," he said, "it's a 9-foot Steinway Model D with 12,000 moving parts. The soundboard is Sitka spruce, slow-grown at high altitudes for resonance. The rim is made of 17 layers of hard rock maple. The keys, once ivory, are now a synthetic composite. It costs more than your Mercedes and holds more stories than your column could ever print." Jack paused for a beat, then his eyes snapped back, sharp as a blade, pinning Langston in place. "It's more than an instrument. Its value isn't in its price tag. It's in the stories it holds. Stories that people who only listen with their ears and judge with their prejudice will never understand." Langston was stunned. The smug grin on his face froze, then vanished. A flush of color began to creep up his neck, a hot red of shame and indignation. He couldn't account for Jack's knowledge, and a vague, unsettling idea about the man's past began to form. Jack Hollis was no longer the overly sentimental janitor. Now, in Langston's eyes, he was an enigma. From her corner, Lena watched it all. Her young eyes didn't understand all the biting words, but she understood the sadness in her father's posture. Silently, Lena slid from her seat and walked toward Jack's old canvas bag. She wasn't just worried, she was taking action. Her small hand reached inside, rummaged around, and pulled out an old music book. Its leather cover worn and faded, the spine cracked. She hugged it to her chest, walked to Jack's side, and looked up at him with her clear eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "will you play something?" Then she held out the book, a gesture full of hope. "Just one piece, just for me." The moment Jack saw the book, the gentle smile he'd been about to give his daughter froze on his lips. The color drained from his face, replaced by the stark white of pure horror. Jack's reaction was immediate and visceral, bordering on rage. Quick as a flash, he snatched the book from Lena's hands as if it were a venomous snake. Don't! His voice was a harsh whisper, but in the hall's silence, it was more startling than a shout. His eyes were haunted and full of pain. Don't you ever touch this again. Do you hear me? The force of his reaction terrified Lena. She had never seen her unpopular like this. Her bottom lip began to tremble, and choked sobs broke into quiet, wounded whimpers. Lena's crying was like a splash of ice water on Jack. The panic in his eyes shattered, replaced by overwhelming regret. He looked at his own hand, still clutching the book, then at his daughter's tear-streaked face. Oh, Lena. Jack dropped the book to the floor as if it burned him. He fell to his knees, pulling Lena into his arms. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, my angel, he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't mean it. I'm sorry. He held her tightly, stroking her trembling back, his heart aching with the realization that he had just inflicted fear on the person he loved most in the world. And from a safe distance, hidden behind a row of stone columns, Celia Kingsley had witnessed it all. She saw not only the tenderness, but also the hidden terror within Jack, and she began to connect it to the fragmented memories of her own. After Jack had carried his daughter away backstage, a silence fell over the hall once more, but now it was heavy with an unspoken tension. Celia Kingsley stepped out from behind the columns, her gaze still fixed on the spot where the janitor and the little girl had just vanished. Celia approached the piano. She didn't sit down right away, but simply ran her elegant fingers over the polished black wood, just as Jack had done, but with a different kind of hesitation. Finally, she took her seat and began to play a short passage. The first few notes rang out, a hauntingly familiar melody, both agonizing and hopeful. It was like a half-told story, climbing toward a crescendo before suddenly breaking off, hanging in the air like an unanswered question. Right on that lingering note, a shadow fell across the keys. Suddenly, Jack was beside her, as silent as a ghost, and he immediately stopped her, not with words, but by placing his calloused hand over the keys, preventing her from playing on. His action wasn't rough, but it held a finality that allowed no argument. That piece, it shouldn't be played anymore. Celia looked up at Jack, her eyes wide with utter astonishment. A fragment of a memory of him flashed through her mind like a forgotten dream. The image of a much younger man in a tailored suit, seated before a piano on a brightly lit stage, wearing the same pained expression. A name almost escaped her lips, but then it faded back into oblivion. Unbeknownst to them both, they were not alone. From behind a marble column not far away, Langston, who had been slyly observing the entire exchange, had put the pieces together. After what he'd witnessed, the erudite comeback, the panic over the music book, and the cryptic act of stopping Celia, the critic had his story. He no longer saw Jack as an annoyance, but as a sensational story waiting to be exploited. And he decided to corner Jack, not slyly but publicly, cruelly, in front of all the guests. Waiting for the string quartet to finish their piece, Langston strode onto the stage, taking the microphone from the bewildered MC. A slight ahem from him echoed through the hall, bringing all conversation to a halt. All eyes fell on him. Ladies and gentlemen, Langston began, we are perhaps too familiar with meticulously staged, perfectly rehearsed artistic performances. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the room with a knowing smile. Tonight, I'd like to present a genuine artist, one who has been hiding in plain sight for far too long. Suddenly, he pointed toward the corner of the room where Jack was standing. A spotlight operator, reacting on instinct, swung a harsh beam of light in that direction. Jack squinted, frozen like a deer in the headlights. Our janitor, Jack Hollis, Langston announced, dripping the word janitor with undisguised contempt. A man who, I believe, has a surprising history with this very piano. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Celia Kingsley shot to her feet, her face pale with horror, knowing exactly what Langston was doing. Langston ignored her, relishing his moment of power. He looked directly at Jack, his voice a challenge. Show us, Jack. Play something truly difficult, to prove that what I saw wasn't a phantom. The trap was set, perfect and cruel. Langston's words weren't an invitation. They were a meticulously calculated psychological blow. He didn't just want Jack to play. He wanted to unearth a secret. Either the janitor would shed his disguise, admitting to his buried talent so Langston could write a sensational article about the forgotten genius, or he would cower in fear, refuse, and become a laughingstock. Langston was certain of either outcome, because in his world, men like Jack never got to win. The pressure was suffocating. Every eye in the room was fixed on the janitor, waiting for an unexpected spectacle. But he didn't look at them. He only felt a small, trembling hand squeezing his own. Lena was clutching her father's hand. She wasn't afraid of the crowd. She was afraid for him. Her clear eyes seemed to plead, "Don't, Daddy, please don't," as if she knew something terrible would happen if he touched the piano. He was about to flee. His first instinct was to turn his back, pull Lena with him, and disappear into the shadows, ignoring the jeers, ignoring it all. But then, a voice cut through the crowd's murmur. From the back of the room, Celia Kingsley spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Play, Daddy." That simple phrase silenced the entire room. Langston Gray's brow furrowed in confusion. His cruel, calculated psychological trap had just been disarmed by a child's innocent plea. Lena continued, her voice now a whisper meant only for him. "I want to hear." The conflict inside Jack reached its peak. He stood between two agonizing choices, his past and his daughter. He slowly knelt, facing Lena, the world shrinking until it was just the two of them. He reached out and gently wiped a tear streak from her cheek. His voice was low and steady, a promise only she could hear. "Then this one is just for you." He stood up. The fear in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a calm but steely resolve. The decision had been made. He gave Lena's hand one last gentle squeeze, then let it go. He walked toward the piano, not to perform but to confront. He sat down and the first notes rang out. It was the same unfinished melody Celia had tried to play earlier. But now it was complete, pouring forth from its true, sorrowful source. Each note wasn't for show, it was to tear open an old scar. The melody grew in intensity, compressing all the pain into one soaring chord that hung suspended between breathtaking beauty and absolute anguish. In that very moment, a choked sob came from the front row. "No. Sonata for Sarah." Celia Kingsley whispered the name, a name she had tried to bury. She clutched her chest, her face contorting not from a heart attack, but from the agony of memory. On stage, Jack's hands froze over the keys. The music died. He had heard it. He had heard the name. Sarah. His eyes shot across the room, locking it onto Celia. Pure horror dawned on his face. He glanced at Lena, and then he understood. This wasn't healing. This was a reenactment. He had made the same mistake all over again. But in that dead silence, someone else had heard the name too. Langston Gray was frozen solid. The color drained from his face. An old article he had written years ago came back to him in sharp relief. Young prodigy Jack Hollis vanishes after a devastating tragedy at an event hosted by his own patron, Celia Kingsley. The fateful night when this piece, written for love, became the soundtrack to his wife's death. All the shattered pieces suddenly snapped together into a single, hideous picture. "It can't be," Langston mumbled, his voice failing him. He shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward, drawing every eye. "Jack Hollis! My God, he's Jack Hollis!" The identification struck the room like a thunderclap. A collective gasp went through the audience. Now they understood. This performance hadn't been a triumph. It was the naked reenactment of a forgotten tragedy. Jack didn't bow. This performance wasn't for them. A smile had no place here either. His gaze swept past the strange faces, searching for a single point of focus. And he found it, Lena's eyes. There wasn't just radiant pride in them, but a complete understanding and a shared pain. He gave her a single sharp nod, a brief acknowledgement that it was all over. The weight of the name Jack Hollis, of the piano prodigy, of the guilt-ridden husband, it had all been laid down right there on that stage. He was none of those versions of himself anymore. Without a backward glance, Jack turned and walked straight into the darkness of the wings. His stride was steady, no longer weighed down by grief. He vanished as suddenly and completely as he had appeared, leaving behind a tangible void and a stunned, silent audience, with only the tragic echo of his music still hanging in the air. The backstage darkness swallowed Jack whole. He found an old prop crate and slumped onto it, elbows on his knees. The silence after the performance was heavier than any applause. Every muscle in his body seemed to uncoil, the exhaustion he had suppressed for years now washing over him like a tide. He didn't hear the footsteps on the dusty floorboards, only sensed a presence when it was already very close. Jack Hollis. The name, an echo from another life, made him flinch. He raised his head slowly, heavily. Celia Kingsley stood there. Under the dim work light, her face held none of the authority of a patron, none of the shock of an audience member. Instead, there was a strange calm, a resolve honed by years of waiting. She looked directly at him, not to scrutinize, but as if to confirm something she had long known. "I've been looking for you for a very long time," she said, her voice holding no blame, only the weight of time. Jack looked up at Celia, his hollow eyes no longer holding panic, only a profound, bone-deep emptiness. His voice was a raw scrape, each word pulled from a deep well. "That piece," he began, staring into the middle distance. "It was a promise, He took a shuddering breath as if the very air had grown heavy. "I promised Sarah it was going to be my last performance. After that night, I was done. I would go home, be a husband, a father completely. No more tours, no more nights away." He looked down at his calloused hands. "She wasn't even supposed to come. She just wanted me to finish and come home. But she never made it home." The final truth was revealed, not in a scream, but in a shattered whisper. "I was on that stage, playing a piece about our future while my wife was dying alone on the road in an accident." He looked up, meeting Celia's gaze, his eyes holding years of self-torture. "So I made a vow. I would never touch a piano again. Because every time I did, I remembered that I chose it over being with her in her final moments." Celia didn't interrupt. She just stood there, absorbing every word, her own face paling with memories she too had tried to bury. When Jack fell silent, tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. "She wasn't alone, Jack," she said softly, her own voice trembling just as much. The words made Jack freeze. "I was there," Celia continued, her voice breaking. "Sarah had called me. She said she wasn't coming, that she just wanted to wait for you at home. But I convinced her. I told her it was your big night, that you needed her in the front row." She brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "I was the one who witnessed the accident. I was across the street. I saw it all. The lights, the sound of metal on metal." She looked at Jack, her eyes filled with an all-consuming regret. "So you see, Jack, I didn't give up on music because it was sad. I gave up on it because every time I heard a concert, all I could hear was my own voice, pushing her to her death." Their confessions hung in the still backstage air, heavier than the performance itself. For all these years, Celia had lived with the guilt of a patron who had unwittingly set a tragedy in motion. whose event had become the stage for such pain. She had searched for Jack, perhaps to find a companion in that grief. Now, seeing the prodigy from all those years ago reduced to a man exhausted by his sorrow, she felt only a deep empathy. They were both prisoners of the same fateful night. The night was late. Lexington Hall now stood empty and still. The stage lights were off, leaving only a few work lamps to cast pale, lonely streaks across the floor. The crowd was gone. Their whispers faded into the night, leaving only three people behind. Jack stood by the grand piano, no longer looking at it as an enemy, but as a silent witness to his life. The pain was still there, but the hatred had dissolved, leaving only a tired, hollow space. Lena walked to his side, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She didn't say a word, just quietly opened it to a new page. Jack looked down. It wasn't the previous drawing. This one had three people. He was seated at the piano, Lena sat at his feet, listening. And standing behind him, a translucent hand resting on his shoulder, was a smiling woman, a figure woven entirely out of musical notes. Jack froze. He knelt beside his daughter, his voice trembling. Lena, how did you know what she looked like? Lena looked up at him, her eyes clear and honest. I don't, she whispered, but every time you talk about her, and especially tonight, when you played that piece, I saw her. She pointed a tiny finger at the musical figure in the drawing. She's there, in your music. It's the only way I ever get to meet her. Lena's words struck Jack like a bolt of lightning. In a single horrifying and illuminating moment, he understood everything. His vow, his silence. He hadn't been punishing himself or protecting Sarah's memory. He had been erasing her. He had been robbing Lena of the only chance she had to meet her mother. His silence wasn't loyalty. It was selfishness disguised as grief. He thought he had chosen music over Sarah, but the truth was, the music was the last thread connecting him, Lena, in the memory of her, and he had been the one to sever it. A choked sob broke from his chest, not for the old pain, but for a new and infinitely deeper regret. He reached out a trembling hand to the drawing, tracing the image of his wife, made from the very melody he had abandoned. Oh, Sarah, he whispered, I'm so sorry. Celia, watching from a distance, quietly wiped away a tear. She didn't approach. This moment belonged to them. She smiled, a truly peaceful smile, because she knew the cycle of tragedy had finally been broken at its root. The story was over, not with silence, but with an uncovered truth. That music was never the thing that tore them apart. It was the only bridge connecting the past, the present, and the people they had lost. And a father, after years of running, had finally understood that the best way to keep a promise, sometimes, is to have the courage to play on.